Hi everyone, it's Jerry. Let's have a look at a game between Leela Chess Zero ID 483, playing on the white end, and Stockfish version 180614. This is the version of Stockfish used in Season 12 Superfinal to defeat Komodo and become the top chess engine champion. So at the moment we're talking about the world's very best engine, Stockfish. Some notes about this game. It is one of 22 played between these two, group of bonus games, acting as an appetizer for Season 13's competition, which is right around the corner. Time controls, 24 minutes apiece with a 16-second increment. Leela is running on two 1080 Ti's, Stockfish is running on 43 cores. If you're interested in some additional specs, feel free to check out this video's description. So let's dive right in and see how this one develops. Opening-wise, it is a Budapest Gambit. After knight g4, a couple approaches now by white. Try and hang on to the pawn or not? When Komodo had this position against Stockfish, Season 12 Superfinal, Komodo chose not to hang on to the pawn. Komodo went for e3 and f4, gives the pawn back, but you'll note something. The structure is a quality one. This game between Komodo and Stockfish resulted in a draw. Leela's option in this game is to try and hang on to the pawn. A downside, note the structure in this game, it is compromised. White is working with double isolated c-pawns. White cannot have it all, and what I mean by that is white cannot try to hang on to the pawn and not work with a poor queenside structure, playing knight d2, as this would mask an important defensive resource of e5. So in this game, it's knight c3. Some attention now on the e5 square, these next few moves, attack and defense, until we get to this point, a point where black can no longer apply piece pressure to e5. Black must treat this as a true gambit by playing f6 right now. There is no time to play castles and hope you could play rook e8 because the knight would be given a kick to a square it's not going to be happy with. f6 right now, true gambit on board, queen d3, and just getting some more development in. White goes for a kingside fianchetto, and both sides now castled. After these 13 moves, where is black's compensation for being down a pawn? What sticks out to me is the structure. It's much better for black. Also, black's pieces are much better. The knights stand very well, and the rooks in particular stick out to me. They're both functioning on half-open files. Compare that with the white rooks. How will they contribute? From here, some defensive e2. Black clears the way, gets the pawn out of the line of fire. This is a strong bishop. h3, bishop g5. This is white's X-factor bishop. In this environment, it doesn't have a great target. Consider the queenside. It's rock solid. White can put all the pressure on d6 and b6. It's not going to collapse. With bishop g5, white's looking to exchange bishop for knight. This is what we have. And now a follow-up knight g5, unleashing an attack against the knight. When I was preparing for this video, one of the variations I questioned was, what would white do if knight e5 is played, attacking the queen and the pawn? If you'd like to, pause the video. Can you see what white can play here? Okay, yeah, I had a serious brain cramp. There is a mate threat also with knight to g5. I overlooked that. Anyhow, two things going on with knight to g5. Black defends the mate threat. Queen d5, king h8. This little sequence is a fancy way to exchange knights. Queen takes knight, queen takes knight. And it is important on this move 21 not to try and pick up a pawn. In the game queen d5 is played. What would be an issue with queen takes c7? Feel free to pause the video. Okay, black would have a tactical shot. Rook takes f2. And if there's a recapture, white will soon be getting killed. f3 will collapse, And here's one way the game could actually end in checkmate. In short, don't pick up the pawn. Reposition the queen, offer a queen exchange. Black says, no, I need to keep the queens on. Queen d4. At the moment, this is white's best piece, and with black's next sequence looks to somehow challenge the queen's post. Very fancy move. Bishop e4. This is probably the first move that captured my attention when I cycled through this game. I thought, what is the story with bishop to e4? Yeah, 2 attackers, only 1 defender. Okay, let's see what the story is. Bishop takes bishop, and now rook f4. Fancy. Taking advantage of the pin g-pawn and placing the bishop in a pin. So what is not a defense for white at this moment, f3 is no good because g3 would collapse and soon white's game. So what does white play here? If you'd like to, pause the video, see if you can spot what Leela plays next. Okay. In the game, it's bishop takes h7. White's giving up the queen. The rook takes queen. This happens. Pawn takes rook. Decision time for the rook. It chooses to stay active. Pressure on white's position. a2, and also looks to pivot. Apply some rank pressure. Third rank. From here, bishop d3. Rook a3. Let's pause for a moment. Something has changed. A lot of things have changed. Material imbalance. White is working with a rook, bishop, and 2 pawns versus the queen. Does anything else stick out to you about this position? Where else does an imbalance exist? If you'd like to, go ahead, pause the video, see what you can come up with. Okay, one other important imbalance is related to king positions. The white king has a cozy shelter, a nice group of 3 pawns. The black king only has 1 pawn. This is what white tries to exploit. White wants to somehow activate the rooks and get at the black king, but it's not clear how exactly to do this, how to activate the rooks. From here, rook a to c1. Possibly preparing for c5, have the c file open up and maybe get to the back rank. Right, that would be mate. The bishop is watching over h7. White gives up the pawn with this last move. Rook takes a2. We don't have c5 at this stage. Instead, first a question is asked of the queen, and the queen goes to a5. If queen f6 is played, white would play c5, and the queen side will open up. This is how the white rooks can become active. I found an interesting variation, if queen f6 is played. If queen takes pawn and takes like this would be losing for black with rook to b1. Interesting that the queen cannot move and stop the rook from getting to the b8 square. And rook b2 would not be a defense either, because in the end there's this. Queen has to give herself up for the rook in this variation. In this game, it's not queen f6, but rather queen a5. Notice how the queen a5 move is interfering with white's attempt to break open the queen side. Playing c5 now would allow chop and then a push. Things are shut down on the queen side. So what is the follow-up here for white? King g2. The idea? To pivot on h1, move the pawn, and then pivot on h4. It's not the typical way to activate a rook. Typically you would want to create pawn breaks, but white is looking to move the pawn and pivot on h4, one of these rook up and over ideas. Takes some time, but okay. This is the approach by white. From here, some pressure on the bishop, possibilities to give up the exchange. h5, it is poison at the moment. Queen takes pawn, and then there's a pin and win of the queen. So black gets out of that idea. Rook h1, queen g5, looking to prevent maybe an h6 move, and also indirectly has an influence on the c1 square. So this prevents black's last move, prevents rook h4, because there would be rook takes bishop. So what white does is play rook b1. Two things: preparing rook h4, now that there isn't this little tactic, and also rook b5. So two ways to try and activate the rook. From here, black plays a5. This is a passer, after all. One thing I questioned is, what would white do if a6 is played, preventing rook b5? White can activate both rooks, pivot both rooks on the h1 square, and get active along the f file and e file in this way. In the game, it's a5, rook b5, queen e7, h6. Trying to strip black of its lone defender, its lone pawn shelter. Rook takes e2. We don't capture the rook. This bishop is far too valuable. What's its important role? Its most important role is to watch over e4. If the bishop is not around to watch over e4, this queen will be a great bother to white. To show you what I mean, let's say white goes in for this exchange and then tries to win this pawn. Queen e4, check. King g1, queen e1, check. There's all these checks, and if king h2, these rooks are not how they want to be, not coordinated, and soon king h7. This queen just becomes way, way too active. Very important to keep the bishop around watching over e4. Stops any perpetual check ideas, and still has an influence on the king side. White can still try to coordinate with this bishop on the h4 square and the pawn. The white pieces are swarming in on the king side. It's declined. No bishop takes rook. Rook f5, rook e4, same story. Bishop takes rook, the queen becomes very active with all these different checks. Rook f3, takes. Yeah, at this point, after rook to f3, this pawn is, needs to go. If you don't capture the pawn, there's going to be a big problem. So, to point out an example, if this pawn just continues to march, you can capture and then play the move rook f4. See how the bishop and the rook are coordinating on h7? This turns out to be a great problem for black. Rook takes f4, you can win the queen like so, and this would be a winning position for white. No time for a4 in this position, nor would there be time to pick up the d4 pawn. This variation is even clear, even a bit more clear with h7, and then a cool move rook e1. Queen takes rook is met with checkmate, rook f8. And if queen here, bishop g6, coordinating on e8, the queen will soon be lost. In short, this pawn has to go. Move 36, it's gone. Rook takes, and only at this point, rook takes d4. White is very close to orchestrating a very nice mating net. Kicking off with rook g6, g4, and then rook h3 mate. So if white tries for this right now, it doesn't work, because what move can black play in this position? If you'd like to, pause the video, see if you can spot it. Okay, here it is. Rook takes bishop. There is no time for rook h3. If you take the rook, wow. What is the queen not hitting? Black is winning. Why am I showing that specific variation? Well, it helps us to understand what white's next move is doing exactly. Bishop f5, the move played in the game, is not only eyeing up an additional checking square, but also just simply getting out of that tactic, rook takes bishop. The idea of rook g6 with then g4 and rook h3 is back on. Black plays a move that helps defend against this. Queen to e8. How is queen to e8 helping to defend? Well, if white now plays rook g6 and then g4, still trying for this, black has a way out by capturing the rook and then capturing on g4. This is apparently a drawn position. Interesting imbalance. 4 connected passers versus a bishop and pawn should be a drawn position. So queen e8, defending against this idea. Bishop e6 check, king g7 in the game, and after the rooks are doubled, something will be making use of f7. A rook will be making use of that square, and a little bit, not long after, the bishop will be making use of that square as well. The rooks are going to eventually force the king to be on the same file as the queen, or white's going to be able to weave some kind of mating net. The king has to step forward. That's just inviting these pawns to help contribute in the attack. There isn't a good way for black to parry mate threats and also hang on to the queen in this position. So what's tried is queen to h8. If this pawn runs like this, there's a check. If the king goes back, that's how you win the queen. And if the king goes forward, here's one way that it could go straight to checkmate. That would be mate. So no time to take off with this pawn. We have queen h8. This is defending the f6 square. Once there's a check, move played in the game, king g6. There is no rook f6. So Leela from here plays rook 7 to f5, clearing the square for the bishop. Black now bolts, a4, bishop f7 check. The king's getting chased to the g7 square, has to go there. Going to one of these two allows a skewer. So king g7, rook g5 check, king f8. Black has to go into a discovered check. Bishop d5, discovered check, rook f7 check, and rook g7. These pieces are lined up. The queen is cornered and does not have very many options. Only 3 safe squares, but going to one of these two, you just win the queen. If black tries to save the queen here, that would mean, let's say, going to h6. But there can follow these checks and even checkmate, like so. This would be a pretty interesting finish. So the black queen is officially gone. Black sees it best to take out the rook. And the only thing to do from here is make sure you hunt this pawn down. Well, that pawn is hunted down. First with the check, ideally placed right behind the passer. And from here, b5, the a pawn is going to be picked up. If rook here, white can play to a7, basically freeze all of these pawns, and then slowly escort these two connected passers. So what's tried here is b5, rook takes a, and eventually we're going to have a position where white is simply up. A full piece, a full bishop at this stage. This game goes only as far as move 58 after rook to b2. Final move of this game. White wins. If this game did continue, this is one of the many ways it could go straight to checkmate. White pawns march. Eventually the black rook has to give itself up for one of the white pawns, and white can't afford to give up the rook for one of the black pawns. And yeah, white is just a little bit too fast, well, more than fast, to get a queen and give mate in this case. So a couple things to share here. I said at the beginning of this game, this was one of 22 games played between these two. The final result of that 22 game match, Stockfish had an overwhelming result. Stockfish had 15 wins, 6 draws, and only this one loss that I shared with you. I still think that this is a really big step for Leela. If you look back at the past competitions, Top Chess Engine Championships, 2014, well, there have only been 3 engines that have defeated Stockfish since 2014. Houdini, Komodo, and Gull. And to have Leela as an AI that has defeated Stockfish at this, in its infancy, is pretty impressive. What are your thoughts? I was going to say, what do you think the results would be, let's say, a year from now? But what about, let's say, by year's end? Where do you think things will be then? I look forward to keeping a watchful eye on it all. I just find this stuff fascinating. So feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care.